to hear firsthand from a highly seasoned executive from, well, not just the UK telecoms paradigm, but also globally. This gentleman brings over 25 years of expertise. He's led a £2+ billion transformation for one of the UK's leading telcos and is now advising other organisations across industries in the telco space across the world. It's my pleasure firstly to welcome the former COO of Three UK and now Director of Graham Baxter. Please give him a round of applause, ladies and gents. In a fireside chat format, we're also going to have the pleasure of hearing from Bhushan Patil, the Executive Vice-President of Prodapt, the cloud-native telco systems integrator specialist. Please give a round of applause for Bhushan. Thank you very much, ladies and gents.
And first of all, thank you very much for joining us. And on behalf of Prodapt, I'd love to welcome all of you and all the panel and guests as well. I think I've known Graham for many years as one of my customers to start with, but then a very astute, as James called out, figure in the industry who has done that, some of the most complex programs and all. And when me and Nastasi were setting up the scene for this event, I think one of the idea was how do we make this as an industry dialogue format rather than just come and say how we are God's gift to mankind and how we can solve all the problems. I think so it's better to make this a forum for learning and listening from experts, and that's why I'm very glad that I have a very esteemed old customer and now a friend and a colleague here. So Graham, thank you for agreeing to do this. Just by way of a little bit of detailing of introduction, maybe I think Graham used to work with Orange in the network space, and then when 3 started with 3G was to be rolled out, I think he was at the helm of it to build the 3G network for 3, and then the 4G and 5G for Three UK. And as most of you might also know, maybe Graham, hear from you, it became the network carrying the maximum data traffic, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So I think, Graham, let me start with the first question there. I think you've been involved in building so many greenfield and brownfield networks, upgrading, changing along the way, plus ground up. How have you seen the network build approach from telcos changing with the advent of time, or it is still the same old? Like one of the things Nastasi called about is lack of innovation. But on the other side, telco always talks about all these XG, YG, all the acronyms in the world are available in telco. So do you think the approach has changed, or how has it evolved over a period of time?
Okay, well, first of all, good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me along. I've been out of the hot seat, if you like, in a telco business for a few years now. So hopefully I can share a little bit of my perspective now from, maybe looking from a step back. So I'm no longer in the middle of the trees. I can hopefully stand back and take a bit of a view of the overall forest. So in terms of that, your question, Bhushan, to be honest, I haven't seen a lot of change from a telco perspective, although I have had a couple of conversations this morning that perhaps shine a little bit of a light on that there is some change coming, which is great. What I would see is that there has been a significant change of approach for greenfield operators. So we had the example earlier of the Rakuten network. So I think going in at a greenfield perspective, a very different approach to traditional telco. But I think what I've seen from traditional telcos is more of a incremental approach. And probably the key reason for that is there's an enormous investment and legacy infrastructure that needs to be taken into account, which makes it much more challenging to take a more radical transformational approach to network evolution. So I haven't seen it, but I am quite hopeful and excited to see it going forward.
And I think the legacy becomes a common problem for all of this. And sometimes people do say, now let me build a new fresh B2B stack or 5. Are they just kind of patchwork to the network, or the new change coming? It's not going to change when people talk about new technology advents coming, 5G, 6G, 7G, I don't know what will come in.
Well, I think
is it because the thinking in the leadership is the same all the time, or it's a scare of mistake? What drives that same old?
I think it's just you have to take into account your existing investments, and you have to take into account your existing operating model. So you can break it down into small parts, and you can look at, say, for example, the technology and say, well, got this amazing new technology, how do I deploy that in my network? But you can't just look at that in isolation. It's the technology. How's that technology going to fit with your legacy technology? How does that change the processes that you set up in your organization? What does that mean for how my organization is set up? What does it mean for the capabilities of the people that I have? What does it mean for the partners that I have already existing in that ecosystem? What does it change for the way I measure and run my business? There's all of these different things that need to get taken into account when you're considering a level of change. It isn't just as simple as saying, well, actually, this is great technology, let's deploy it. Okay. There's all of these things that need to be taken into account. And I think my observation, and again, it'd be interesting to hear from people on the floor whether it's changed. My observation is that most organizations aren't set up to think in a very, what I would say, a sort of systemic way. So considering all of those aspects of the operating model. Okay. So it tends to be, because things are complex and, it's easier to break things down to the smaller parts and for those to operate independently. But if I share an analogy that I used to use, it's like if you think of something like Formula One and all of the things that go into a successful Formula One team, what you find is that they look at a Formula One car as from a very holistic perspective. If the engineers responsible for the engine and the engineers responsible for the aerodynamics and the people responsible for the tyres and the electrics and all the rest of it were actually working in isolation of each other. And then they all worked to optimize their part of the car, and then they came together to put it together. Would you end up with a world-beating Formula One car? And the answer is no, you wouldn't. So you have to actually compromise some of those components in order to get the better performing overall Formula One car. And that is, I think, if you want to optimize a network and get the better performing network, you need to think of the whole thing. And breaking it down into component parts and optimizing those component parts doesn't end up with an overall optimal performing business. That's maybe a
good. No, I think thanks.
Interesting way to think about it.
No, I think that is true. And many times you see that sometimes technology becomes a vanity project because, like you said, this component I will make it work the best. But then if it is not fitting the overall picture, perhaps a lot of good intentions go down the drain.
Yeah, but I mean, just the bit we heard earlier about, from Rakuten, I think is absolutely the right approach. And what I heard is you're trying to tackle complexity, and complexity is a real challenge for Telco. And doing that through a mixture of sort of simplification of how the network's constructed, but also the use of AI and machine power. For how do you take all this data and make some sort of sense in driving your business forward? But what I didn't hear is how do you look at things from a systemic point of view, from a telco point of view, and how do you address the legacy challenge? And how do you understand how this new stuff fits with the existing?
Okay, good. Maybe moving on, similar next one. I think telcos have become now the lifeblood of every business. It used to be a vertical in itself. Now it is a horizontal driving industry, driving every other business. But when you are in such a dominant position as an industry that every other industry depends on you, telco is still an industry running out of fighting for cash, fighting for growth, struggling for numbers, revenue, or profitability. How do you see that coming up, and why do you think we landed up in that kind of, as an industry, we landed up in that zone? It's a little bit of a provocative question, but I think
it's a challenging question, right? Yeah. But I'll answer it in two different ways. So one of it, from my perspective, and again, maybe this is easier because I'm now sat in my house in the Cotswolds rather than sat in my office in Maidenhead or Reading. If you boil it right down to a very simple level, I always like to draw triangles. So the people who know me, I'd sort of start by drawing a bit of a triangle. And if you imagine at the top of that triangle, you've got services, bottom right, you've got customers, and then the bottom left, you've got cost. So ultimately, your customer is interested in getting reliable services at a reasonable cost, right? And that, if you really boil it right down, that's what they're looking for. As an operator or as a telco, you've got to provide reliable services, but at a reasonable cost to your business, and you've somehow got to manage it so that your revenue coming in from the customers, is more than the cost you're investing in your network. But you've actually both got the same thing in mind. You're both trying to create these reliable services. And that's a simple point, that's what you need to do. The challenge is, particularly as the networks evolve and capacity requirements go up, there's a lot of investment required in your infrastructure. But it's quite hard to actually shift the dial on increasing revenues from your customers. So the answer is either you grow, so you have more customers, or you extract more money from the customers that you've got, and that's pretty difficult to do in a very competitive environment. So that's the crux of the situation. And so I think from an operator point of view, how you drive to absolutely the lowest cost per bit is critical. And how do you do that? You do that deploying the latest capabilities in a very simplified and efficient manner. So it really comes down to cost per bit.
Okay.
How do you do that?
Okay. And I think that brings me to the right segue to the next one, right? Because I think getting a lot of money...
Before you do, Bhushan, because I was going to mention my second thing.
No,
Sorry to interrupt, but this is a bit, I didn't talk about the second part of it, which is the customer perspective. So, and you talked about telco, and you used some words there around, driving the whole thing and being critical. Where does the telco fit from a customer perspective? And I would argue that as a customer of telco services, I'm probably more interested in my device and my services than the network. That's quite brutal, but that's how I would see it as a customer. So if I'm a customer, my question to all of you guys would be, I'm going to select my device, whether I'm an Android or an Apple or whatever fan, and I'm interested in my services, which these days tend to be over-the-top services. Where in my thoughts are the network, and what would my selection criteria be for which network I chose? So what differentiates one network from another? It's actually quite a hard question to answer. Yeah. Coverage was interesting. So let's take the UK on coverage. So great question. This is good, by the way. It'd be good to get some interactive questions. But in the UK, how many networks do we have?
4 plus lots of small ones.
4. Okay. So how many network infrastructures do we have?
2 and additions.
2, basically.
2.2 plus more.
Okay. Well, I would argue that outside of the 4 operators and 2 networks, there's very little in terms of, there might be some small networks here and there, but actually the majority of the networks are covered by those 2. And then if you think about things like, okay, so what's the difference between those 2 networks? If you actually laid one of those network shares on top of the other network share, what would the difference in coverage be? What do you think?
Very limited.
And then say, okay, if you don't know, but it's not going to be huge. And then you consider...
You've got different spectrum allocations.
There is.
There are absolutely things, whether it's indoor penetration, whether it's a lot of other specific sites.
Yeah, no, you're right. But I would say it's a diminishing issue because of consolidation of networks, but also things like the rural network share agreement between all 4 operators. That's a single network. So actually it's diminishing. And if you think about where are most customers based, where do they live, and how's the coverage in those areas? So most of the operators would target their network evolution and network coverage from where is the population. Yeah. No, I'm not saying coverage isn't an issue, because I'm sure for a lot of people it is an issue. And you would select a network operator because, so for example, my village has very good coverage from 3 and EE, and very poor for O2 and Vodafone. So I would hazard a guess that most people who live there would be choosing EE or 3. And by the way, I'm not biasing that because I used to work for 3. There'll be other villages that are completely the other way around. But I think as an overall majority of customers, be relatively few in that position these days. But of course, then you've got to, it becomes complex because you're right. There's different spectrum, and the spectrum's used for different things. So some's used for 2G, some's used for 3G, although that's going away. 4G, 5G, and can I get all of those technologies where I am? And it becomes a quite different question. So the footprint of a 5G network in the UK is very different to the footprint of 2G or 4G. But it is an interesting question because that comes back to, what is it that the telcos need to do in order to put themselves front and center in a customer decision to go with them.
No, and that was my next question, because the explosion of data is it's almost like limitless data being expected and asked for. And you rightly said that while telcos are providing this, a lot of their network doesn't feature because a lot of other services and products are available for them to consume on the back of network. So how does you or anybody in the CTO or network organization align with the customer so that network becomes either a differentiator for getting that extra revenue? Is it the network side, plus is it about building newer products and services that are different to the same data and voice kind of connectivity? How does one, from a network point of view, align with that changing need?
Okay. I would say to start with, there's probably two, and it comes back to my triangle.
Yeah.
So you've got to drive the lowest cost per bit, because ultimately that gives you the biggest profit margin. Your revenue is going to be your revenue, and if you want to maximize your profits, you've got to lower your costs. So what is your lowest cost per bit? And if with data volumes going up massively, then that becomes quite critical. And then probably equally important, if not more important than that, is really understanding what is it your customers need and how do you provide the service that they need, be it coverage in the right places, be it the reliability of the services so they work all the time. So a really good customer experience. So I think if you can get a great customer experience and you get the lowest cost per bit, you're in a pretty good position. The third one, once you've got those basics in place, I would say, is how do you create some level of innovation and differentiation on top of that? So how do you perhaps try and turn the clock back a few years or a few decades maybe, where telcos actually offered things that were uniquely offered by the telcos and not offered by others. So I think there's great actually opportunity to offer innovation on top of those basics, but I think you've got to get the basics right.
Yeah. There's a question coming in.
Yeah, quick question. Ray LeMaitre from Telecom TV. In what you said so far, are you talking about all kinds of customers equally, or do you think there's an opportunity for, do you think there's an opportunity for the service providers to differentiate between what they do for consumer customers and what they do for enterprise customers? Or is that too much of a headache for the operators and they just need to think in one great big mass?
No, I think the interesting thing for me about customers is they're all different. And I think what I see, and this doesn't just apply to telcos, but companies that are successful have something that is meaningful to that specific customer of theirs. The reality is that telcos have quite a diverse set of customers. They do want different things. And so if you can tailor your offering to meet the needs of those different customers, then I think that is a real differentiating point and something that will make you more successful. So whilst I think that I'd be an advocate for simplicity in terms of how networks are constructed, I wouldn't apply the simplicity to what you just said and say, actually, I'm going to offer the same thing to everybody. I'm going to offer a completely vanilla service. I think there is value in offering tailored services to meet the needs of specific segments of your customer base, be it consumer or enterprise. I think it was mentioned earlier about things like network slicing, and there's some pretty cool capabilities that are coming along that are made for differentiating services. Now, that will be interesting for some customers and it won't be interesting for others. But I think if you can get smart about what you can offer.
So where does this innovation come from then? Clearly not from just the basic network infrastructure.
I mean, it can do, because I think, again, on service level, it doesn't look that important, but actually from a customer point of view, for them to have a reliable service requires an end-to-end service. And that's actually quite complicated to achieve in reality. So under the covers, on what seems to be a very simple service, is quite complex. And I would hazard a guess that, if I went to the various telco networks that are in this room today, and I looked at the end-to-end way things have been designed and implemented, I would see them all done in a slightly different way, and there would be room for optimization. So I think it's not as straightforward as that. I think you can be, you need to look at things from a end user perspective and then see how does your service actually perform all the way along the chain, because any weak points in your service is degraded in some way or form, be it lower speed, lower capacity, lower reliability. And I sort of test that point with, if I was a customer and I phoned up any telco and said, how's my I've got an issue with my service, can you actually diagnose where that issue is? It's pretty hard to do. You can at a very high level, but actually get right down to specifically me and my service and exactly where is the issue in my network and what do I need to optimize is quite difficult to do.
And I think that point, I think even not just for consumer, even for enterprises are asking for this kind of question. Like you said, they are different, the needs are different, but giving a simple clarity on why your service is not what it should be is very difficult for telcos to diagnose.
It's complicated. I mean, particularly as we're getting into, again, another thing that was mentioned earlier was cloud. Everything's moving to virtual. Trying to track down issues in a virtual world is much more tricky than going down to a failure of a hardware component in a specific, element that we used to do in the past. It's much trickier.
Let's see if the Rakuten Symphony people agree.
Yeah. We'll be listening from Madhu afterwards. Probably he will.
I'm not saying it's impossible, but it does require thinking about. Because it's what I was saying about that, going back to the operating model, and you can change the technology. So let's say we've now moved from element components to a virtualized, cloud environment. But then you've got to think about the process, and the process you applied to fixing and identifying issues and resolving issues in a element based to a virtual is very different. So it changes everything. It changes your technology, it changes your processes, it changes the capabilities you need to run those processes. It changes everything. It changes the whole operation. That's what I was, right back to the start, you have to look at the whole thing. And it's amazing when you look at things systemically, how if you change one thing over here, how that ripples through the whole organization. And that is something that's not often understood, but very often experienced when you're actually trying to implement something.
Sure. There was a question there. Yeah.
Hi, Robert Curran from Appledore Research. You described a moment ago, it's kind of a related question, the complexity of understanding service in this more modern world.
Yep.
Does that imply that telcos have got, at the most senior level, got to make a fundamental decision whether to invest in being smart about that level of sophistication, personalization, insight, analysis at a per consumer, per app level, or frankly, to go down market, if you like, and say, what, we're just going to be a super efficient utility. We're going to leave all that upside stuff to digital service companies of some other kind. Is that a fork that you see the industry having to take? Because it's unlikely, on the evidence currently, that telcos are going to be good at everything. They're going to stay flat and be mostly rubbish most of the time, if you look at the last 10 years. So I'm interested in understanding, are we at this seismic change moment? And if so, what's the appetite? for telcos to go one way or the other. It's not a good or a bad thing, but you can't constantly chase two completely diametrically different, diametrically opposed goals, if that makes sense as a question.
Okay, how would I answer that? I'd say, back to my triangle. Okay, so whichever way you go, whether you go for the utility view or you go for the being innovative, you've got to get the basics right, and the basics come back down to lowest cost per bit and reliable performance services.
I guess that's part of my point. Sorry to interrupt. Lowest cost per bit doesn't really apply. On the upside of that, it's all about service. It's all about customers. It's all about NPS. It's all about, hey, we're ranked number one by opinion. Cost per bit goes out the window at that point. It's a cost to serve. It's not about the traffic. It's about the digital services. On the other hand, if you're in the utility business, absolutely it's cost per bit. And it's not about those other things. That's what I'm trying to understand, that the metrics of what you are as a telco have to be decided, and they probably have to change. Is it the first set of metrics or the second set of metrics? Which one are you going to be? You've got to make the choice, is the question I'm asking.
Yeah. And it could be either, but I think to do the latter, so you're not focused on just the cost per bit, then you've got to embrace the technologies, and you can't apply the traditional telco approach to networks in the new world. You've got to take a different view. So I was quite looking at parallel industries as a good example of perhaps how to unlock the answer to this question. So let's take banking, right? So unrelated to telco, but banking, and you've got your traditional banks. But if you look now, you've got smaller banks that are setting up, I'll throw out a few, so Starling, a good example, or Greenfield. And they've started embracing the new technology in a new way, so it's a completely different approach to the way the whole business is run. And then you're going to get quite innovative services. So if I swipe my Starling card and I'm getting a ping on my phone straight away to say that I've just bought myself a coffee downstairs or whatever it is. But that's creating a whole load of additional value add services that I'm quite interested in. For a telco to do that is quite difficult. Not because of the technology necessarily, but it's how you embrace the whole change to your operating model in order to deliver the outcome from a customer perspective. So I think the telcos can do it, but it requires not just a shift in technology. It requires a shift in the whole operating model. I don't know whether that answers your question or not, but I guess I would say it's definitely within a telco's gift to not just focus on cost per bit and be a bit pipe provider, to actually offer innovative services. But in order to do so, requires a fundamental change of your operating model.
It's fine. You have to decide which one you want to do. That's my point. And that's the question I'm asking is, do telcos think that's what they have to do? Or do they just think...
Well, I'm not a telco, so I can't answer the question. So I'm not the right person to answer. There's probably people in this room who can. What I'm saying is it's entirely possible, but it requires a fundamental shift in the construct of how you think about it in order for that to be possible. Otherwise, you end up defaulting to the first option.
We'll take one quick question and then we'll go to the last question. I think we're...
Okay, I'm going to be a heretic here. Dean Bubley, Disruptive Analysis. I think cost per bit is a terrible metric. If you're a dark fibre provider, you don't care how many bits your wholesale customers push over it because you own the asset. Why do we think cost per bit, particularly at a national level, has relevance in the 5G and especially 6G era?
Okay. That's a fair challenge, and thank you for the question. So the way I think about cost per bit is how much, so that is every cost. So how much as a business does it cost me to support the level of traffic that's on my network? So how do I get my organization optimized? So, because ultimately, what are the customers are receiving data volume? They're receiving services.
Retail customers. If you're City Fibre,
Yeah.
You don't know how many bits Vodafone and TalkTalk or whoever else pushes over your network.
But I would say that the cost per bit for City Fibre would be the cost for them to roll out their infrastructures, to dig up the roads and put the fibres in. That's cost per bit. It's not just the cost of, the bits of kit that you've got on the end. It's the whole cost of running your company. That's your cost per bit. And if you've got a world where traffic volumes are going at an exponential rate, okay, so they're not in the so you're saying the data's flat.
It's flattening. Exponential is increasing acceleration.
Yeah. So I would say that data volumes are going up massively. Okay, maybe not exponential, but that's a bit too much. But yeah, data volumes are growing massively. That's a reality. And you're always going to get more services used by more people at a higher data rate. And how you provide that whole infrastructure and setup as an organization, ultimately the costs of that have got to be offset against the income that you're going to receive for the services. That is the basic economics of it.
So I think
so what you spend on your company has to the least money you spend there means that you get a higher level of margin.
So I think you have one side, demands keep going up, but nobody wants to pay for it in more than proportionately. I think that's where the challenge of the industry lies. One question on that is, with cloud and AI and all this demand changing and customer asking, and I think the question from the gentleman also was about whether the telcos need to rethink. I think you alluded to that as well. How do you think this impacts the way you build your human capital or organization? Because one is the technology aspect, one is the customer, but all of that is ultimately being served by the people. You've been a CEO, you have been running a technology organization. How does that aspect change? I mean, in terms of people, you need different training, recalibrate. How does somebody in that position look at changing the organization below? For the modern
the simple answer would be with difficulty. Part of the challenge for any existing organization, be it Telco or any other organization, is that when there is a fundamental shift in operation, how you evolve and transform your existing operating model into a new operating model is really hard to do. Which is why, going back to the very first question you asked me about, do I see significant transformations or do I see incremental change? I see the latter, because it is so hard to change an operating model.
But don't you think that will eventually, it's a widening circle that telcos will never catch up with the idea of going ahead of just becoming a utility provider? Or are there examples from the industry that you see that somewhere some people are solving it better than others in that sense? Or it's across
I've seen it's more solved through the greenfield operators, so it is possible. It's absolutely possible. It's just difficult.
Okay.
There's no easy way around it. There's no magic solution.
Absolutely.
But I would say it's not something that's telco specific. That's the same. If you look at what's happening in the banking industry, it's exactly the same.
Absolutely.
It's hard to do. But not impossible.
Not impossible, absolutely. And I think that's where people like Prodapt and Rakuten come into play to help that change, most probably just putting it that. But thank you very much. I think that was my last question, and I think we are on the time. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you everyone for asking the questions.
Thank you for the questions. Yeah, very good.
Thank you very much.